The silence that settled over the sun-bleached parking lot that afternoon was not the kind that followed shock or tragedy, but the kind born from witnessing something profoundly human that few expected to see. Moments earlier, Paul Walker had been laughing with a group of young fans, the sleeves of his worn t-shirt pulled slightly by the breeze, the reflections of polished chrome dancing in his eyes. It was a simple charity car meet in Santa Clarita, one of many he attended away from flashing cameras, drawn not by publicity, but by the hum of engines and the stories behind them. No one there imagined that a single conversation between him and a stranger would shift the entire atmosphere from casual excitement into a stillness so heavy and reverent that even the engines seemed to quiet themselves. This is the story most people never heard, the one buried behind the headlines and the mythology that formed around his name. A moment small yet vast enough to redefine how those present remembered him forever. It began, as such moments often do, with something ordinary. A middle-aged man weaving through the rows of cars, his gait steady but carrying the weight of years few could read. His cap, faded by sun and time, held the insignia of a unit most would not recognize. His hands were calloused, not only from labor, but from memories too sharp to speak aloud. He approached a '69 Camaro displayed beside Paul, a car restored by a local veteran support group, its paint a deep metallic blue reminiscent of the sky just before dusk. Paul had been admiring it with the ease of someone who saw machinery as more than metal, someone who understood the emotional circuitry behind every bolt and weld. When he noticed the man standing hesitantly nearby, he offered a smile that felt like an invitation rather than an obligation, a quiet gesture that told the man he didn't need permission to speak. The veteran introduced himself softly, almost apologetic, explaining that the Camaro had belonged to a friend who never made it home. His voice wavered, thin but steady, as if each word was a thread pulled from a fabric patched too many times. Paul listened in a way that few people truly do, not nodding mechanically, nor offering platitudes, but giving the man space to let memory breathe. For a moment, it felt as though the bustle of the event receded, as though the sound of chatter, revving engines and distant laughter dimmed to allow something raw and unguarded to unfold. In the veteran's story lay an ache that had survived decades, preserved like an echo trapped behind the ribs, resurfacing only when someone gentle enough asked without speaking. It was in the middle of this quiet exchange that Paul asked him about the friend who once drove the Camaro, not as a celebrity seeking a poignant anecdote, but as a man honoring another man. The veteran's eyes glistened with a vulnerability that startled even him, yet Paul's presence held the moment steady. Listeners around them sensed the shift, and slowly the circle widened. People who moments before had been discussing horsepower and aftermarket mods now found themselves leaning inward, pulled not by spectacle, but by sincerity. And here, in this unfolding tension, is where I ask you, from where in the world are you watching this? Your answer in the comments shapes the strange, quiet community that gathers around stories like this one. Stories filled with shadows and light, loss and unexpected grace. As the air thickened with unspoken emotion, Paul placed his hand on the veteran's shoulder, a gesture so simple yet grounding. He told him that the car, in its restored beauty, stood as a testament not only to his friend's service, but to the life he lived before uniforms and orders defined him. He asked if the veteran had ever driven it since its restoration. The man shook his head, explaining that he couldn't bring himself to. It felt too sacred, too intertwined with a grief he had never learned to unfold safely. Paul paused, his expression shifting into something firm yet tender, as though he understood exactly what the man needed even before he did. Then, with a quiet conviction that rippled through the crowd, Paul walked to the driver's side of the Camaro and opened the door. The hinges released a soft groan. He turned back to the veteran, offering him the keys with an outstretched hand that trembled only slightly under the weight of the moment. Gasps travelled through the onlookers like a shiver. No one expected this. No one expected Paul to insist gently, telling the veteran that some memories are meant to be carried forward, not sealed away. The man stood frozen, breath caught in his chest, decades of silence pressing against the possibility of release. What happened next would be remembered more vividly by those who witnessed it than any autograph or photo they might have hoped for that day. The veteran reached for the keys with a hesitance carved from years of avoidance, and Paul stepped aside, giving him space as though stepping back from sacred ground. The crowd remained still, reverent, and when the veteran finally lowered himself into the driver's seat, his hands trembling as they touched the wheel that once belonged to his brother in arms, several people wiped their eyes openly. As the engine turned over, its deep rumble reverberating through the lot, the veteran closed his eyes. Some thought he might break, crumble beneath the weight of memory. Instead, he exhaled, long, slow, releasing what seemed like years of trapped breath. And in that suspended moment, every person watching understood something fundamental about Paul Walker, something truer than fame and faster than the stories printed on glossy magazine covers. They understood that kindness, when genuine, doesn't perform, it transforms. Stay with this story. And before we move on, if you're feeling the pull of this moment, let it guide you into joining us. Subscribe, not as a formality, but as a way of stepping into a space where these hidden human stories continue to be told, where light and shadow share the same frame, and where memory breathes again through the act of listening. The veteran sat behind the wheel, his fingers trembling on the worn leather, and for a moment he didn't move. The sound of the idling engine seemed to echo inside him, a heartbeat long forgotten. Around the car, the crowd held its breath. Paul stood beside the open window, his hands loosely tucked into his pockets, gaze fixed not on the crowd, but on the man inside the Camaro. He wasn't performing for anyone. He wasn't trying to create a scene. He was simply there. A bridge between the living and the lost, between what had been left behind and what still needed to be carried forward. The late afternoon sun reflected off the windshield, casting slanted rays across his face, softening his expression into something almost reverent. The air vibrated with the engine's steady pulse, and then, as if guided by instinct, the veteran shifted the car into gear. The tires rolled gently over the pavement, the car moving forward with a grace that defied its age. The crowd parted slowly, forming a lane of silence. The Camaro glided through, its engine humming like an echo of everything unspoken between brothers who never got to say goodbye. Paul watched, his lips curved into a small, solemn smile. The veteran circled the lot once, twice, each lap loosening the invisible chains that had bound him for years. The tension in his shoulders softened, the stiffness in his jaw eased. When he finally parked, a quiet fell so deep that it felt sacred. He turned off the ignition, and in the sudden silence, the crowd could hear the sound of his breathing, uneven, trembling, alive. He opened the door slowly and stepped out, his eyes wet. Paul moved toward him, and without hesitation, the two men embraced. It wasn't the kind of embrace born from comfort, but from understanding. An unspoken exchange between souls who knew the weight of carrying ghosts. The veteran's hand clutched the back of Paul's shirt, as though afraid that if he let go, the moment might vanish, and with it, the fragile peace he had just found. Paul whispered something only the veteran heard, and whatever those words were, they broke something open in him. Later, when asked about it, one of the witnesses said that the man simply nodded, wiped his face, and murmured, "He told me to keep driving." That was all. But for him, it was enough to change everything. What many didn't realize was that Paul had quietly supported several veterans' programs long before this moment. He donated, volunteered, and often appeared anonymously at fundraisers where his name wasn't even listed. To him, it wasn't about headlines, it was about humanity. He believed that service, whether on the battlefield, in a community, or even through kindness, connected people in ways fame could never replicate. Those who knew him well said he carried stories like the one from that car show with him, tucked behind his easy smile. They became part of the quiet fuel that drove him, both on screen and off. He once told a close friend that helping someone rediscover hope was like fixing an engine that had been sitting too long. It just needed the right spark. In the days that followed the car show, the story of that encounter began to spread, not through tabloids or official channels, but through whispers, through online forums and community boards, told by those who had been there and couldn't forget what they'd seen. One attendee described how, after the veteran drove the car, several strangers walked up to shake his hand, thanking him for his service, their eyes glassy with emotion. Another said Paul stayed long after the event ended, helping volunteers pack up, refusing to leave until every last car had rolled out of the lot. He laughed with kids, signed posters for free, and handed out bottled water like an ordinary guy. There was no camera crew, no PR handler, just Paul and a handful of people who'd witnessed something real. The veteran's story didn't end there. A week later, he reached out to the same charity that had restored the Camaro. He offered to volunteer, saying that he finally understood what it meant to drive forward. In his message, he mentioned Paul by name, though humbly, as if afraid of cheapening the gesture by attaching it to fame. What he didn't know was that Paul had already donated again, this time anonymously, enough to fund the restoration of 2 more cars that had belonged to fallen soldiers' families. When the organizers told the veteran, he wept. "He didn't just give me back a memory," he said. "He gave it motion again." That's what Paul did. He gave motion to things that were stuck: people, grief, dreams, even cars, which for him were never just machines. To Paul, they were extensions of people's lives, vessels of memory. Every scratch, every dent carried a story. He often said that cars had souls, not because of their engines, but because of the hands that built them and the hearts that loved them. That belief made his connection to others effortless. He didn't have to speak much. His presence did the work. When the veteran met him, he wasn't meeting a celebrity. He was meeting a man who understood silence, loss, and the need for release. There was something hauntingly cinematic about that day, as if the universe had paused to script a moment that would outlive everyone there. The golden California sun began to sink, washing the lot in a soft amber glow. People started leaving quietly, many with tears drying on their faces, unwilling to break the spell. Paul stayed behind, standing beside the Camaro, looking at the empty driver's seat as though still seeing the man inside. A volunteer approached him and said softly, "You really changed his life." Paul smiled faintly, replying, "No, he just remembered he still had one." Long after everyone left, a few volunteers lingered to clean up. They saw Paul walking slowly between the rows of cars, running his hand along the hoods as though saying goodbye. He paused for a while beside a black Supra, his own car, before finally getting in. The rumble of the engine broke the quiet, and for a moment it was the only sound left in the fading light. He didn't rev it to show off. He simply drove off slowly, headlights fading into the dusk, leaving behind an unspoken lesson about presence, empathy, and how sometimes the smallest gestures can echo the loudest. If you could have stood there in that silence, you would have felt it too. The strange, electric awareness that something sacred had just unfolded in front of ordinary people who would carry it for the rest of their lives. Many of them still talk about it online, even years later, recalling every detail with precision as if it happened yesterday. One man wrote in a forum that he went home that day and hugged his father, a Vietnam veteran, for the first time in decades. Another said he sold his show car and donated the money to a charity in Paul's name. That's the kind of ripple one act of genuine compassion can create. Invisible, but unstoppable. Paul's friends often said he believed that everyone has a moment that defines them, and that you never know when it will arrive. For him, maybe that moment wasn't captured in a movie, or a race, or an award, but in the quiet embrace of a stranger at a car show. And maybe that's what he wanted all along, not to be remembered for speed, but for stillness. Not for how loud his engines roared, but for how deeply his actions resonated when the engines fell silent. If you've made it this far, It means something inside you recognizes that kind of stillness too. Don't let it fade. Stay here with us, where stories like these are kept alive, where humanity is remembered not for fame or fortune, but for the flicker of kindness that can turn an ordinary day into a lifetime of meaning. Subscribe, not for the algorithm, but for the stories that deserve to be heard, stories that remind us of the fragile, fierce beauty of being human. The story of that day didn't stay contained within the cracked asphalt of the car show lot. It spread quietly, carried by word of mouth and memory, whispered between people who'd been there, retold with trembling voices in garages, veterans' halls, and family kitchens. It was never about the car itself, or even the celebrity who stood beside it. It was about the unexpected collision of two lives, one who had seen too much, and one who simply refused to look away. In the months that followed, the story would return to Paul again and again in conversations, not because he sought it, but because others brought it to him. Strangers approached him at charity events to say how much they'd heard, how much it meant to them. Each time he deflected the praise with the same modest smile, saying, "It wasn't me, it was him. He just needed someone to listen." But those who knew Paul best understood something deeper, that he was carrying something from that encounter, something invisible but heavy. He was known for his calm, grounded presence, but after that day, friends noticed moments when he grew distant, thoughtful, as though replaying the sound of the Camaro's engine or the look in the veteran's eyes. One close friend described it as a silence that had meaning. Paul had always been kind, but there was a subtle shift now, a greater urgency in his generosity, a deeper tenderness in his laughter. It was as if that encounter had reminded him how fragile time really was, how easily a life could slip into memory. And perhaps, in some quiet corner of his heart, he knew that moments like that were what he would leave behind. Not films, not fame, but fragments of truth shared between souls. In late November of 2013, just days before the tragedy that would end his life, Paul attended another charity event, again for Reach Out Worldwide, his organization that provided disaster relief around the world. Those who were there said he was in high spirits, joking with his team, helping arrange supplies, signing shirts for kids who couldn't believe he was real. But there was something reflective in his eyes too, like someone who understood the weight of what he'd built. He wasn't chasing the spotlight anymore. He was chasing impact. The story of the veteran and the Camaro had become part of the quiet mythos surrounding him, and though Paul never spoke about it publicly, he often hinted at the idea that real power comes from presence. He once told a friend, "If you're lucky, life gives you a few moments that make you stop running. You see someone's pain and realize that's where you belong, right there in that silence." On the morning of November 30th, the day everything would change, Paul was helping organize another car show for charity. The event was filled with the same energy that had defined so much of his life: laughter, community, the smell of fuel and asphalt, the hum of engines like heartbeats stitched together in harmony. Among those attending were veterans, mechanics, families, many of the same kinds of people who had gathered around him at the Camaro event months earlier. Paul moved through the crowd like sunlight, greeting everyone, thanking volunteers, making sure the donations were in order. He wasn't supposed to stay long. He was just checking in before heading back to see his daughter. But as fate would have it, he decided to stay a little longer, a few more minutes, just enough time for one last drive. What many people don't know is that earlier that day, before stepping into the Porsche Carrera GT, Paul had been speaking to a small group of attendees about veterans' issues again. Someone had brought up the Camaro story. Word had clearly spread. And Paul, usually reserved about such things, smiled quietly and said, "Yeah, that was a good day. That's what it's about, right? Moments that matter." He didn't elaborate, didn't dwell, but those nearby said his voice softened on that last sentence, as if he knew the truth behind his own words more than anyone realized. Moments that matter. Maybe, in some way, he sensed how little time any of us truly have to make them. When the accident happened, the world froze. News spread like wildfire, but for those who knew the man behind the fame, it wasn't the noise of tragedy that echoed. It was the silence, that same silence that had fallen over the car show lot months earlier, when Paul had handed the veteran the keys. The same stillness that descends when something sacred takes place. For days, people who'd witnessed that earlier moment came forward online, leaving comments, stories, fragments of memory. One man wrote, "He made us all stop and feel something that day. I didn't know him, but I think he lived exactly the way he wanted, helping people drive forward." Another said, "He didn't just play a hero in movies, he was one in real life, and not because of how he died, but because of how he lived." Even the veteran, the man whose life Paul had unknowingly changed, heard the news. Friends said he sat in his garage for hours, the Camaro parked silently before him, unable to start it. Finally, as night fell, he opened the garage door and sat in the driver's seat. The moonlight reflected off the hood, turning the car into something almost spectral. He turned the key and the engine roared to life, loud and defiant, echoing into the stillness of the night. He drove slowly through the empty streets, tears streaming down his face, whispering a simple thank you to the sky. In that moment, the gesture had come full circle. The same compassion Paul had shown him now became his way of saying goodbye. The following week, hundreds gathered to pay tribute. Among them were people from all walks of life: friends, fans, strangers, veterans. Some brought flowers, others brought stories. And somewhere in that crowd stood the man with the Camaro. He parked it near the memorial, its deep blue paint reflecting the flicker of candlelight. When people asked about it, he told the story quietly, as though afraid of breaking something fragile. And when he finished, many were left in tears. He ended with the same words Paul had once told him. Some memories aren't meant to be sealed away. They're meant to keep driving. That car became a living tribute, not only to the soldier who once owned it, but to the man who'd helped reignite its spirit. Over the years, it appeared in several small charity events, always accompanied by the same veteran who told the story, not to glorify it, but to remind people what empathy looks like in motion. Every time he started the engine, he said he could still hear Paul's voice, soft, reassuring, reminding him that healing doesn't come from forgetting, but from remembering differently. What's haunting is how closely this all mirrors the themes Paul embodied on screen. In Fast and Furious, the story was about family, loyalty, redemption, but beneath the adrenaline and the roar of engines, it was always about connection, about finding meaning in speed and peace in stillness. Paul lived that. His life wasn't an act. It was the quiet translation of those same values into the real world. He gave his time, his money, his heart, not because he had to, but because it was who he was when the cameras stopped rolling. And maybe that's what makes his legacy so heavy, yet so full of light. Not the tragic way it ended, but the luminous way it unfolded. Every act of kindness, every small gesture, built a pattern of grace that outlived him. The car show moment was just one of many. A glimpse into the truth that behind the fame, there was a man who listened, who cared deeply, and who believed that every person deserved to feel seen. The veteran once said in an interview, years later, "He didn't fix my car that day. He fixed something in me." For everyone who's still here, still remembering, still finding themselves drawn to stories like these, maybe you feel that same quiet pull. The reminder that compassion doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be real. And if that kind of truth moves you, if you believe in holding on to the moments that matter, stay with us. Subscribe, not out of habit, but out of heart. Because stories like this deserve to be kept alive, whispered again and again, until silence turns into memory and memory becomes light. Years passed, and the world moved on, as it always does. But some stories resist being buried by time. They live not in headlines or anniversaries, but in the quiet spaces where memory lingers, in the low hum of an engine, in the reflection of a sunset on polished metal, in the faint echo of laughter that once belonged to someone who changed the world not through grand gestures, but through gentle ones. Paul Walker became a legend for what he did on screen, but the truth of who he was, the version of him that stood in a parking lot and handed a veteran a set of keys, became the story people told when they wanted to remember what kindness really looked like. The veteran still keeps that Camaro. It sits in his garage, covered with a black cloth, its edges dusted with the faint shimmer of years gone by. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he pulls the cover back and runs his fingers over the cool metal, tracing the faint scratches that time never erased. He doesn't drive it often anymore, not because of sorrow, but because he no longer needs to. He says that every time he hears a car engine rev in the distance, it reminds him of that day, of that man, of the way his grief finally exhaled. He speaks of Paul not as a celebrity, not as an icon, but as a friend he met once who somehow changed the direction of his life forever. A few years after Paul's passing, the veteran helped organize a charity drive in his honor. Dozens of cars lined the same kind of sunlit California street where the story had begun. Among them were old muscle cars, imports, trucks, each with stories of their own. But at the center of it all, gleaming beneath the afternoon light, stood the blue Camaro. On its dashboard, taped carefully beside a small folded flag, was a photograph of Paul, smiling, relaxed, eyes half squinting in the sunlight. Beneath it, a handwritten note read, "Keep driving forward." People came from all over that day. Some didn't even know why they felt compelled to be there. They just knew this story, or some version of it, and wanted to be part of its echo. There were fathers with their sons, veterans with medals pinned to their jackets, fans clutching posters and die-cast cars. The veteran spoke softly to the crowd, his voice raspy with age, but steady with meaning. He told the story again, the same one that had begun in a car show parking lot years ago. He spoke of loss, of healing, of the simple moment that changed everything. And when he reached the part where Paul handed him the keys, his voice broke slightly, the silence around him deepening. He didn't have to, he said, but he did. And because he did, I got to live again. After the event, a young man approached him, maybe 20 years old, wearing a faded Fast and Furious shirt and nervous eyes. He said quietly that his father had been a veteran too, that he'd struggled after coming home, and that watching this story online had given him courage to reach out, to reconnect, to forgive. "That moment between you and Paul," the young man said, "it saved my dad." The veteran smiled softly, placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, and said, "Then it wasn't just for me." That's the strange thing about compassion. It multiplies. One act, one spark of genuine humanity ripples outward in ways no one can measure. Paul's kindness that day didn't end with the veteran. It grew. It reached people who never met him, who never heard his voice, who only knew his face through the glow of a movie screen, but felt something deeper. The authenticity that cannot be scripted. It's what makes his memory linger not as a headline, but as a heartbeat. Those who worked closest to him in his foundation, Reach Out Worldwide, still carry that same energy forward. They travel to disaster zones, rebuild homes, deliver aid, and comfort those who've lost everything. Many of them say that every time they arrive at a site, they think of Paul, the way he used to walk straight into the rubble, sleeves rolled up, ready to work alongside everyone else. He didn't just donate. He dug, he lifted, he listened. That's who he was. And though he's gone, that spirit never left. It lives in every hammer lifted, in every wall rebuilt, in every life quietly made whole again because of the seed he planted. And perhaps that's the true definition of legacy. Not fame carved in marble or memories captured on film, but the invisible threads of compassion that continue weaving themselves through other lives. The veteran often says that Paul taught him something he didn't know he'd forgotten, that healing is contagious. When someone gives you a moment of grace, he once told an interviewer, the only way to honor it is to pass it on. So he does. Every year he donates part of his pension to veteran support charities, always signing anonymously. He says Paul showed him that real kindness never needs a name attached. It's been more than a decade now, and yet the story refuses to fade. Every few months, it resurfaces online. A video clip, a Reddit post, a whispered retelling. Someone always finds it for the first time and leaves a comment like, "I didn't know this about Paul. I'm crying right now." Ward. And in those small digital echoes, his spirit stays alive. Not in fame, but in feeling. People across the world continue to share where they were when they first heard it, how it made them feel, what it reminded them to do. And maybe, right now, as you listen to this, you feel that same warmth rising somewhere deep inside, that small reminder that the best parts of people never really leave. Because in the end, the story of Paul Walker isn't just about how he lived or how he died. It's about how he made others live again. It's about a veteran who found his voice, a crowd that found its silence, and a world that found a new kind of hero. Not one who raced cars or won trophies, but one who stopped in a parking lot long enough to see someone's pain and do something about it. That's the version of Paul that deserves to be remembered. The one who didn't need cameras to be kind. The one whose quiet humanity outshone his fame. And maybe that's what this story is meant to remind us. That sometimes, the most powerful things we can do don't come with applause. They come in moments no one expects, between strangers, in the simplest exchange of empathy. Paul understood that, and if there's one thing his story asks of us, it's to carry that forward, to look at the people around us and see them, really see them, the way he did. So as this story draws to its close, let it linger. Let it move through you like the rumble of an engine that refuses to die out. If it touched something in you, if it reminded you that compassion still exists, that humanity still breathes even in the quietest corners, don't let it stop here. Keep it alive. Share it. Leave a comment below about how it made you feel, where you're watching from, or who you thought of while listening. Your words might be the spark someone else needs. And if you haven't yet, join this space, subscribe, stay with us, not as an audience, but as a part of this ongoing circle of stories that remind the world what kindness truly looks like. Like this video if it moved you, not for the algorithm, but because every small act of remembrance helps light the path for another soul to find it. Because as long as these stories are told, Paul's spirit keeps driving, through us, through every heart that listens, through every act of grace that keeps the engine of humanity running. So wherever you are right now, in your room, on the road, under the same wide sky, take a breath, feel the weight of silence, and remember, some stories never end. They just keep driving forward.